At approximately 1:03 p.m. on December 22, 2025, in the international waters of the Eastern Pacific Ocean, a quiet target moved through the darkness without lights, without a clear national flag, and without any sign it expected to be challenged. The vessel was small, low in the water, and fast, built to disappear rather than fight. Yet, in that moment, it became the focus of U.S. military power. This was not a clash between rival navies, and it was not a traditional law enforcement boarding. According to an official release from U.S. Southern Command, American forces conducted a direct strike against a suspected drug smuggling vessel operating far from any coastline. The decision marked a clear shift, because instead of interception and arrest, the operation escalated to the use of military force. In recent reporting by Reuters and the Associated Press, U.S. officials confirmed that smuggling networks have increasingly armed their boats, used military-grade navigation tools, and moved farther into open seas to avoid capture. The strike raised an uncomfortable question for everyone watching. Why destroy the vessel instead of seizing it? The answer lies in how these routes have changed and why the ocean is no longer treated as neutral space. This was not a Coast Guard chase. It was a signal. If you want to understand how the U.S. is reshaping its fight at sea, subscribe to Military Power, because what happens next shows how far this strategy is willing to go. The boat was small by naval standards, but it was designed for one purpose, and that purpose made it dangerous. Built low to the water, narrow in profile, and stripped of any unnecessary weight, the vessel could cut across open sea at high speed while staying difficult to detect. Its hull was reinforced for long runs rather than comfort, and its engines were tuned to move fast for hours without stopping. From a distance, it looked like a fishing craft or a private transport, yet its design followed a pattern seen again and again in smuggling operations across the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean routes. What made this boat matter was not just how it moved, but how it worked within a larger system. Smuggling vessels like this one rarely travel alone in purpose, even when they appear isolated on radar. They are timed to leave coastal launch points after weather shifts. They follow routes tested through past runs, and they rely on layers of support that stay out of sight. Intelligence reports described this boat as a relay link, moving loads from larger supply ships farther offshore towards smaller crews that could reach land without drawing attention. In that chain, speed and timing mattered more than firepower. The crew operating the vessel understood the risks, and their behavior showed it. They avoided fixed shipping lanes, stayed silent on common radio channels, and adjusted course in ways that suggested training rather than improvisation. These movements were not random. Analysts tracking the route noted that similar boats had appeared in the same waters before, each time connected to seizures of narcotics in Central America and the southern United States days later. The pattern was clear enough to raise concern at higher levels. This was not a boat carrying a single shipment meant to disappear quietly. It represented a moving piece of a corridor that stretched across regions, linking producers, transit zones, and distribution networks. The Eastern Pacific had become one of the preferred paths for traffickers because of its size and the difficulty of constant patrol. From there, loads could be split and redirected toward the Caribbean, Mexico, or smaller island routes, depending on pressure from law enforcement. Vessels like this one made that flexibility possible. U.S. officials assessed the threat based on repetition and scale rather than appearance. Each successful run strengthened criminal networks by proving that routes remained open. Each delivery funded the next stage, paying for fuel, crews, corrupt contacts, and replacement boats when others were lost. Over time, this cycle turned small craft into strategic tools. According to public statements from U.S. Southern Command and reporting by major outlets such as Reuters, the volume of narcotics moving through maritime routes had remained high despite years of interdictions, forcing a reassessment of how these targets were handled. The decision to remove the vessel, rather than attempt a boarding, reflected that shift. Boarding required close approach, cooperation, and time, all of which increased risk when crews were willing to flee, resist, or scuttle their own boat. Intelligence suggested that some smuggling crews had been instructed to destroy evidence if interception seemed likely. In that context, the boat itself became the priority target. Eliminating it disrupted the route more effectively than seizing one load. What mattered most was the role the vessel played within a network. It was not an independent operator chasing profit on a single trip. It was a tested asset used repeatedly, supported by logistics and informed by experience. Removing it sent a message beyond the immediate area, signaling that certain corridors were no longer safe for routine passage. That message was aimed as much at planners on shore as at crews at sea. This approach marked a harder edge in the fight against maritime smuggling, where speed and anonymity had long favored criminal groups. By targeting the tools that made those routes reliable, U.S. forces aimed to introduce uncertainty into systems that depended on predictability. The loss of one boat forced adjustments across the chain, slowing movement and raising costs for those involved. This vessel mattered because it was not just carrying drugs. It carried confidence built through repetition, and removing it challenged the belief that the open ocean could still hide these operations. That realization set the stage for the next phase, where surveillance and tracking turned quiet movement into an exposed chase. The operation began long before any order to strike, because the most important phase was watching rather than chasing. High above the Eastern Pacific, U.S. aircraft moved in wide arcs, scanning empty water where normal traffic was rare and patterns were easier to read. These aircraft did not search for a single boat by chance. They compared movement against known smuggling corridors, weather shifts, and past routes used by criminal crews. What looked like open ocean to the naked eye was already mapped and measured through weeks of quiet observation. Surveillance at sea worked the same way, relying on patience instead of speed. U.S. vessels held distance, using sensors rather than proximity to understand what was unfolding. The goal was not to announce presence or force a reaction. It was to let the target reveal itself through behavior. Small changes in course, steady engine output, and long periods of radio silence carried meaning when placed in context. Each signal added weight to an assessment already forming. Drones played a central role in filling the gaps between air and sea. Flying lower and slower than manned aircraft, they watched without drawing attention, tracking heat patterns and surface movement while remaining out of sight. Their feeds confirmed what analysts expected to see. The boat moved with purpose, not drift. Its course avoided commercial lanes, and its timing aligned with known smuggling windows. This was not coincidence. It was repetition. From the deck of the smuggling vessel, the situation felt calm and controlled. The crew saw no patrol ships cutting across the horizon and no aircraft descending overhead. The sea around them appeared empty, and the absence of warning reinforced the belief that their precautions had worked. They had chosen distance and darkness to create safety, trusting that space itself would protect them. That belief was exactly what watching exploited. Isolation made the vessel easier to study, not harder. With fewer contacts nearby, every movement stood out when viewed from above. When the boat slowed briefly, it matched behavior seen in earlier runs where crews adjusted timing. When it corrected its heading, the shift lined up with current data rather than random drift. These details confirmed training and intent. The key difference in this operation was restraint. U.S. forces did not rush to intercept or attempt early contact. There was no urgent pursuit because urgency favored the target. Instead, commanders allowed the vessel to continue under observation, moving deeper into a space where options narrowed and outcomes became clearer. Time worked as a tool, shaping the encounter before it happened. This approach reflected lessons learned from past interdictions. Early engagements often ended with cargo dumped overboard or boats deliberately damaged to erase evidence. In other cases, high-speed maneuvers created danger for both sides. By delaying action, U.S. forces reduced those risks. The longer the boat traveled under watch, the more predictable its decisions became. Inside command centers, data from aircraft, drones, and ships flowed together. Operators compared live feeds with models built from previous smuggling cases, confirming expectations step by step. Each match reduced uncertainty. The vessel was no longer just a contact. It became a known element within a familiar pattern, moving along a path that had already been studied. This created a sharp contrast between perception and reality. To the crew, the ocean still offered cover and silence. To those watching, the boat was already fixed in space, its speed and heading measured and its future options limited. Control existed without confrontation. Decisions were made before any visible move. By the time action approached, the outcome had been shaped quietly and deliberately. The watching phase ensured that when force was finally used, it would not be reactive or rushed. The crew believed they were unseen, but in truth, they had been tracked, timed, and contained from far beyond their view. That unseen control set the stage for the moment when observation ended and direct action began. The moment force was used did not arrive with chaos, shouting, or confusion, but with a quiet decision made after long control. For hours, the vessel had moved under watch, its position known, its speed measured, and its future options already limited. When commanders chose to act, the shift was immediate, because delay would only give the crew time to react. This was not an arrest on land with sirens and commands. It was a military action at sea, where hesitation creates danger. The order traveled fast through the chain of command. Aircraft adjusted altitude, sensors locked in, and units already in position aligned for one clear objective. There was no broadcast warning and no attempt to call the vessel over open channels. The goal was not compliance. The goal was removal. The boat was identified as a working tool of a criminal network, and that tool had to be taken out of use before it could complete another run. When force was applied, it was brief and deliberate. Firepower was used in a controlled way, aimed at disabling the vessel rather than creating a prolonged fight. There was no exchange of sustained gunfire across the water and no dramatic chase through the dark. Within seconds, the boat lost movement and control. Its engines failed, its direction collapsed, and its role in the smuggling route ended. The sea returned to silence almost immediately. Waves closed in, and the open water looked unchanged to anyone watching from a distance. That quiet was intentional. U.S. forces avoided turning the operation into a spectacle. They applied only the amount of force needed to end the threat, and then held position. The absence of chaos was a sign of planning, not restraint forced by chance. For the crew on board, the experience unfolded without warning. One moment, they believed they were moving unseen through open ocean. The next, the vessel was no longer under their control. There was no time to dump cargo, destroy equipment, or attempt escape. The window for action closed before it fully opened. That speed removed uncertainty and reduced the risk of unpredictable behavior. This approach reflected lessons learned from years of both maritime operations and gang arrests on land. In city raids, officers rely on surprise and speed to prevent suspects from fleeing or reaching weapons. At sea, the principle remains the same, but the environment is harsher and mistakes are harder to recover from. By acting quickly, U.S. forces prevented a situation where desperation could escalate into danger. There was no negotiation because negotiation would have changed the balance. A warning could have triggered evasive maneuvers, collisions, or deliberate attempts to destroy the vessel. Silence preserved control. When action came, it came without debate. The decision had already been made before the crew understood what was happening. Precision defined every second of the strike. The firepower used was selected to achieve a specific result, not to show overwhelming strength. The objective was to stop the vessel, not to send a dramatic signal through excessive force. That distinction separated this moment from open warfare. It remained a focused use of military capability in support of a defined mission. The speed of the action also carried meaning beyond the immediate scene. Smuggling networks depend on routine and timing. They rely on the belief that distance at sea creates safety, and that reactions take time. This operation challenged that belief. It showed that when conditions are set, response can be nearly instant. As the disabled vessel drifted and began to sink, the practical effect became clear. One link in a larger chain was gone. Fuel, cargo, and planning invested in that run were lost. More importantly, confidence was shaken. Routes that once felt reliable now carried doubt. This moment was not about spectacle or punishment, it was about denial. By removing the platform instead of chasing it, U.S. forces denied criminal networks the ability to operate as planned. That denial changed calculations far beyond the location of the strike. If you were part of a smuggling crew watching this from a distance, would you still trust the open ocean to protect you? Or would this force you to rethink every future move? That question hangs over what comes next, as attention shifts from the strike itself to the consequences that followed in its wake. The message behind this operation became clear after the water settled and the immediate action ended, because this was not handled like earlier drug cases at sea. In the past, U.S. forces focused on boarding vessels, arresting crews, and collecting evidence that would later appear in courtrooms. Boats were seized, suspects were processed, and investigations continued for months or years. In this case, that familiar pattern was set aside. The vessel was not treated as a criminal suspect waiting to be charged. It was treated as a threat that had to be removed before it could operate again. This difference marked a shift in thinking that has been building for years. Smuggling boats were once viewed as disposable tools, easily replaced and limited in impact. Experience changed that view. Some vessels proved too valuable to criminal networks to ignore. They were reused across multiple runs, adjusted after each encounter, and protected through careful planning. Over time, these boats stopped being simple transport. They became moving infrastructure that sustained entire routes. When a platform reaches that level, arresting one crew does not solve the problem. Another team can step in, and the route remains alive. U.S. planners recognized that pattern and responded accordingly. By choosing to disable the vessel instead of capturing it, they focused on denial rather than prosecution. The goal was to remove capability, not gather testimony. This logic mirrors approaches used in domestic gang enforcement. Police do not always rely on arrests alone to weaken organized groups. They seize vehicles used in crimes, shut down properties used as hubs, and cut access to tools that make operations possible. Removing those assets often creates deeper disruption than arresting individual members who can be replaced. At sea, the same principle applies, but the environment is harsher and mistakes carry higher risk. The decision also reflected how smuggling networks have evolved. These groups are better funded, more disciplined, and more willing to test limits. Some crews now operate with training and equipment that make routine boarding dangerous. Treating every encounter as a standard law enforcement action ignores that reality. This operation acknowledged that certain vessels now fall into a different category. The message sent to trafficking networks was direct and unsettling. The open ocean is no longer a safe buffer. Distance from land does not mean distance from consequence. Routes that once relied on isolation now face constant observation. Patterns are noticed, movements are tracked, and decisions can be made without warning. For planners on shore, this changes calculations immediately. Each departure carries new risk. Every run could end without negotiation or retreat. That uncertainty weakens confidence and raises costs. Fuel, crews, and timing all become harder to manage when predictability disappears. This approach was not about spectacle or punishment. It was about rewriting expectations. By treating some smuggling vessels as security targets rather than arrest cases, U.S. forces signaled a new set of rules at sea. The water may still look empty, but it no longer offers protection, and that realization leads directly into the broader consequences examined in the next section. The escalation did not start with another strike or a new target, but with a quiet shift in how future actions would be understood. What happened at sea changed the meaning of the response itself. For years, transnational drug trafficking was treated mainly as a criminal problem, even when it crossed borders and involved violence. Arrests, seizures, and court cases formed the expected path. This operation pushed that boundary by using force in a way that looked less like policing and more like security enforcement. This fragile line matters because it defines how power is applied. Law enforcement actions focus on individuals, evidence, and legal outcomes. Military-style actions focus on speed, control, and removal of capability. When a smuggling vessel is treated as a security threat, the timeline compresses. Warnings shorten, choices narrow. The shift does not erase the law, but it changes how quickly decisions are made and how much room remains for hesitation. The waters near Venezuela make this shift more sensitive. This region already carries layers of tension, including heavy drug traffic, weak state control in some zones, and long-standing political strain. Smuggling routes run close to national waters and near areas where armed actors also operate. Any force used here travels beyond the immediate scene. Even an action aimed at criminals can echo across borders and trigger concern from others watching closely. Criminal networks understand this complexity and often depend on it. They move through spaces where responses are cautious, assuming that fear of escalation will slow action. The recent operation challenged that belief. It showed that in certain conditions, avoiding confrontation will not outweigh the need to deny access and control. That message forces traffickers to rethink how safe these routes truly are. The danger now lies in misreading intent. As force becomes an accepted option, the margin for error shrinks. A vessel linked to crime may operate near civilian traffic or close to sensitive zones. A fast decision meant to stop smuggling could be seen by others as something more aggressive. Even without hostile intent, perception alone can drive reaction and raise tension. This is how escalation often grows. It does not arrive as a single dramatic moment. It builds through repeated choices that stretch limits a little further each time. Each action sets a reference point. Each reference point lowers the barrier for the next move. Over time, responses that once seemed extreme begin to feel normal. For the sea space near Venezuela, this creates uncertainty. Increased surveillance, faster engagement, and broader threat definitions raise the chance of contact. Smuggling groups may adjust by hiding among civilian routes or seeking protection through alliances with armed actors. These changes increase risk for everyone involved. From a strategic view, the United States faces a difficult balance. Stopping transnational crime requires decisive action. Preventing wider conflict requires restraint and clarity. Holding both at once becomes harder as operations move further from arrests and closer to denial through force. This chapter does not predict immediate war. It explains the opening of a new space where decisions carry heavier weight. The line between crime control and military action still exists, but it has become thinner. In such conditions, small choices can shape long-term outcomes. As this new reality settles, attention turns outward. The next stage will be defined by how criminal networks, regional actors, and governments respond to this shift, setting the stage for the reactions that followed. This operation did not unfold as a major naval battle, and it did not end with dramatic images of large fleets facing each other at sea. Yet its importance lies in what it signaled rather than how much force was used. A single vessel was removed, but the message traveled far beyond that point on the map. It showed that the United States is willing to treat certain maritime smuggling threats as matters of security, not just crime, and to respond with military capability when conditions demand it. By acting decisively in open waters, U.S. forces demonstrated that key sea routes are not left unguarded or ignored. The ocean may appear vast and empty, but it remains under watch, and challenges to control are met with preparation rather than hesitation. This approach reflects a clear intent to protect maritime corridors that matter to national interests, even when the threat does not wear a uniform or fly a flag. What comes next depends on how smuggling networks respond. If these vessels continue to test limits and rely on distance as protection, the risks they face will only increase. Each move invites a countermove, and each challenge reshapes the rules of engagement at sea. If you want to follow how these quiet confrontations are changing the fight beyond headlines, like and subscribe to Military Power. And here's the question to consider. If the ocean is no longer a safe zone, how long before traffickers are forced to change their entire playbook?